The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as Lady Beatrice Worthington made her way through the ornate corridors. As the newly appointed queen consort, she had been struggling to find her place within the ancient walls that had housed royalty for centuries. The weight of her new title pressed heavily on her shoulders, made even more burdensome by the constant comparisons to her predecessor. Princess Isabella Cambridge, the beloved duchess who had captured the hearts of the nation, remained a formidable presence within the palace walls. Her grace, elegance, and natural charm had endeared her to both the public and the royal staff. Isabella's ability to navigate the complex web of royal protocol while maintaining her authentic warmth had set an impossibly high standard. The tension between the two women had been simmering for months, like a pot left too long on the stove. Lady Beatrice felt overshadowed at every turn. When she attempted to implement new charitable initiatives, the staff would inevitably mention how Princess Isabella had handled similar projects with such finesse. When she hosted state dinners, whispered comparisons echoed through the dining halls about Isabella's legendary attention to detail and her ability to make every guest feel personally welcomed. On this particular morning, the annual Children's Charity Gala was scheduled for the following week. Lady Beatrice had spent countless hours planning every detail, determined to prove herself worthy of her position. She had chosen the floral arrangements personally, selected the menu with the head chef, and even designed the seating chart to ensure optimal networking opportunities for the various charitable organizations. However, when she arrived at the blue drawing room for the final planning meeting, she discovered that several key decisions had been quietly overruled. The florist had been contacted directly by Princess Isabella's personal secretary, requesting changes to the arrangement colors. The menu had been modified to accommodate Isabella's preferred caterer, and most surprisingly, the guest list had been expanded to include several of Isabella's personal friends from her charitable work. Lady Beatrice felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack. She had worked tirelessly to establish her own identity within the royal framework, only to find herself constantly living in Isabella's shadow. The frustration that had been building for months suddenly erupted into something she could no longer contain. "How dare she?" Beatrice exclaimed to her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, as they stood in the corridor outside the drawing room. "This was my event, my opportunity to show what I can accomplish. But once again, Princess Isabella swoops in with her suggestions and improvements, making me look incompetent in the process." Margaret, a seasoned palace employee who had served 3 different royals during her career, tried to maintain diplomatic neutrality. "Your Majesty, perhaps Princess Isabella was simply trying to be helpful. The charity gala has been one of her patronages for several years." "Helpful?" Beatrice's voice rose sharply, echoing off the ornate ceiling. "There's nothing helpful about undermining my authority at every turn. The staff treats her as if she's still the reigning queen, bowing and scraping to her every whim while barely acknowledging my presence." The conversation continued as they walked toward Isabella's private quarters. Lady Beatrice's anger intensified with each step, fueled by months of perceived slights and diminished authority. She had entered this marriage with genuine love for King Edward, but the reality of royal life had proven far more challenging than she had anticipated. Princess Isabella's room was located in the East Wing, a beautiful suite that overlooked the palace gardens. The rooms had been her sanctuary during her years as the Duchess, and she had been permitted to maintain them even after the change in succession. The walls were adorned with family photographs and personal artwork, creating a warm, intimate space that contrasted sharply with the formal staterooms throughout the palace. When Lady Beatrice arrived at Isabella's door, she could hear the soft sound of classical music playing within. Isabella was likely preparing for her afternoon engagements, which included a visit to a local hospital and a meeting with the board of directors for her literacy foundation. Despite the changes in her official status, Isabella had maintained an active schedule of charitable work, endearing herself further to the public. Lady Beatrice knocked firmly on the door, her resolve strengthening with each passing moment. When Isabella opened it, dressed in an elegant navy dress with her hair perfectly styled, Beatrice felt another surge of resentment. Even in her private moments, Isabella managed to look effortlessly regal. "Beatrice, what a pleasant surprise," Isabella said with genuine warmth, stepping aside to invite her in. "I was just reviewing my notes for this afternoon's hospital visit. Would you care for some tea? The offer of hospitality only served to irritate Lady Beatrice further. Here was Isabella graciously welcoming her into what should have been Beatrice's domain, acting as if nothing had changed in the palace hierarchy. "We need to discuss the charity gala," Beatrice said without preamble, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I'm told you've been making changes to my arrangements without consulting me first." Isabella's expression shifted slightly, a hint of confusion crossing her features. "I hope I haven't overstepped any boundaries." When the florist called asking for advice about color schemes that might photograph well for the media coverage, I simply shared some thoughts based on previous events. "I certainly didn't intend to undermine your planning, but that's exactly what you've done," Beatrice replied, her voice growing stronger. "Whether you intended it or not, your helpful suggestions have made me look incompetent in front of the staff. They've been going to you for guidance instead of following my instructions." The room fell silent except for the gentle ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Isabella moved toward the window, looking out at the gardens where she had spent countless hours with her children during their younger years. The weight of the accusation hung heavily between them. "I never meant for that to happen," Isabella said softly. "The transition has been difficult for everyone, and I suppose old habits die hard. The staff has worked with me for so many years that they naturally turn to familiar routines." Lady Beatrice felt her composure slipping further. Isabella's reasonable tone and apparent understanding only made her feel more irrational, which in turn fueled her anger. She had come here expecting a confrontation, but Isabella's measured response left her feeling off balance. "It's not just about habits," Beatrice snapped. "It's about respect and recognition of authority. I am the queen consort now, not you, but everywhere I turn I'm reminded that I'm somehow lacking compared to the previous regime." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Isabella turned from the window to face Beatrice directly. For the first time, a flash of something harder crossed Isabella's features. Not anger, but a steely resolve that reminded everyone why she had been such an effective royal for so many years. "I have never compared you unfavorably to anyone," Isabella said, her voice maintaining its calm tone despite the tension in the room. "I have tried to be supportive during what I know is a challenging transition. If my presence makes that more difficult, perhaps we should discuss how to better manage the situation." But Lady Beatrice was beyond rational discussion. The months of frustration, the constant comparisons, and the feeling that she would never measure up had reached a boiling point. In that moment, all her careful royal training disappeared, replaced by raw emotion and wounded pride. "The situation would be much easier to manage if you weren't constantly interfering," she shouted, her voice echoing through the room. "Every time I try to establish myself, there you are with your perfect smile and your perfect ideas, making it clear to everyone that I'm just a poor substitute." Isabella stepped back slightly, clearly taken aback by the intensity of Beatrice's outburst. In all her years of royal service, she had rarely encountered such raw emotion directed at her personally. The training that had prepared her to handle difficult public situations seemed inadequate for this personal attack. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside indicated that Beatrice's raised voice had attracted attention. Palace staff were trained to be discreet, but they were also protective of the royal family members. The commotion would undoubtedly reach the ears of the security team. Lady Beatrice seemed to realize that she had crossed a line, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her position. "From now on, you will stay out of my events and my decisions. I don't want your advice, your suggestions, or your helpful interference. Is that clear?" Isabella nodded slowly, her face having assumed the neutral expression that royal training had ingrained in her. "Perfectly clear," she said quietly. "I'll make sure to communicate that to my staff as well." The response should have satisfied Lady Beatrice, but instead it made her feel even more frustrated. Isabella's composed acceptance made Beatrice's emotional outburst seem childish and unreasonable in comparison. Once again, Isabella had managed to take the higher ground, leaving Beatrice feeling diminished. As if on cue, there was a firm knock at the door. "Your Majesty?" came a voice from the corridor. It was Captain James Morrison, the head of the Royal Guard, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations within the palace walls. Isabella moved toward the door, but Lady Beatrice stepped in front of her. "I'll handle this," she said sharply, then called out, "Come in, Captain." Captain Morrison entered the room, his experienced eyes immediately assessing the situation. He had served the royal family for over 15 years and had developed an instinct for detecting tension. The body language of both women clearly indicated that something significant had occurred. "Is everything all right, Your Majesty?" he asked, directing his question to Lady Beatrice while keeping Isabella in his peripheral vision. "Everything is fine," Beatrice replied curtly. "Princess Isabella and I were simply having a discussion about upcoming events." Captain Morrison's gaze shifted between the two women, noting the flush in Lady Beatrice's cheeks and the carefully controlled expression on Isabella's face. His years of experience told him this was far more than a simple discussion about events. "Very good, Your Majesty," he said diplomatically. "If there's nothing else, I'll return to my duties." But as he turned to leave, Lady Beatrice made a decision that would change the course of the day dramatically. Her anger, frustration, and wounded pride converged into a moment of poor judgment that she would later regret. "Actually, Captain, there is something else," she said, her voice taking on an imperious tone that she had never used before. "I want Princess Isabella to remain in her quarters for the rest of the day. She's not feeling well and shouldn't be disturbed." Both Captain Morrison and Isabella stared at Lady Beatrice in shock. The request was highly unusual and potentially problematic from both a security and protocol standpoint. Isabella had scheduled appointments that afternoon, and confining a member of the royal family to their quarters required specific justification. "Your Majesty," Captain Morrison said carefully, "Princess Isabella has several commitments this afternoon. The hospital visit and the foundation meeting are both on the official schedule." "Cancel them," Lady Beatrice ordered, her voice brooking no argument. "Princess Isabella is indisposed and will not be taking any appointments today." Isabella finally found her voice. "Beatrice, this is unnecessary. I have obligations to fulfill, people who are counting on me to—" "I said you're indisposed," Lady Beatrice interrupted. "Captain Morrison, please ensure that Princess Isabella remains in her quarters until further notice." For her own well-being, of course. The room fell into a tense silence. Captain Morrison found himself in an unprecedented situation, receiving what amounted to an order to confine one member of the royal family at the request of another. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but this particular situation fell into a gray area of protocol and authority. Isabella looked directly at Captain Morrison. "Captain, I want to be clear that I have no intention of defying any reasonable security measures. However, I also have responsibilities that cannot simply be cancelled without proper notification." Lady Beatrice stepped forward. "I am giving you a direct order, Captain. As Queen Consort, I expect it to be followed immediately." Captain Morrison nodded reluctantly. "Very well, Your Majesty. Princess Isabella, I'm afraid I must ask you to remain in your quarters for the remainder of the day. I'll have someone notify your appointments of the change in schedule." As the implications of what had just occurred began to sink in, Isabella felt a chill run through her. She had been effectively confined to her room by someone she had tried to support and help. The absurdity of the situation was matched only by its potential consequences. Lady Beatrice, meanwhile, felt a momentary surge of satisfaction. For the first time since becoming Queen Consort, she had asserted her authority in a way that could not be questioned or undermined. Isabella would no longer be able to overshadow her or interfere with her plans. But as Captain Morrison left to arrange the security measures and make the necessary calls to cancel Isabella's appointments, Lady Beatrice began to realize that her moment of triumph might have far-reaching consequences she hadn't fully considered. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows of Isabella's quarters, but the warmth it provided seemed diminished by the weight of the situation that had just unfolded. Both women remained in the room, each lost in their own thoughts about what had just transpired and what it might mean for their future relationship. The palace, with its centuries of history and tradition, had witnessed many conflicts between its residents over the years, but few had ever resulted in one royal family member being confined at the order of another. As word of the situation began to spread through the corridors, staff members exchanged worried glances and whispered conversations. The incident had crossed a line that couldn't easily be uncrossed, setting in motion a series of events that would test the very foundations of royal protocol and family relationships. Lady Beatrice had gotten her wish. Isabella would no longer be able to interfere with her plans, but the cost of that victory was yet to be fully realized. In the quiet of Isabella's room, with only the sound of the antique clock marking the passage of time, both women contemplated the irreversible nature of what had just occurred. The morning had started like any other, but it had ended with a confrontation that would redefine their relationship and potentially shake the very foundations of the royal household. The afternoon settled into an uncomfortable stillness within Princess Isabella's quarters. After Lady Beatrice had left with a satisfied expression that didn't quite mask her underlying uncertainty, Isabella found herself alone with the reality of her situation. The ornate room that had always been her sanctuary now felt like a beautifully appointed prison. Captain Morrison had stationed 2 guards discreetly in the corridor outside, their presence a constant reminder of her confinement. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella. The same security measures designed to protect the royal family were now being used to restrict her movements. She sat by the window overlooking the gardens, watching the groundskeepers tend to the roses that she had personally selected years ago during her tenure as the primary royal resident. Her personal secretary, Miss Eleanor Hartwell, arrived within the hour, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Eleanor had served Isabella for over a decade and had never encountered a situation quite like this. She entered the room with a tablet full of notifications and expression of barely contained confusion. "Your Royal Highness," Eleanor began, her voice carefully neutral, "I've received several calls regarding your appointments today. The hospital administration is particularly concerned, as the children's ward was specifically prepared for your visit. The young patients have been looking forward to meeting you for weeks." Isabella closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of disappointment from people she had never even met. "Please convey my sincere apologies to the hospital staff and the children. Explain that an urgent family matter has arisen that requires my immediate attention. Offer to reschedule as soon as possible." Eleanor made notes on her tablet, though her expression suggested she was struggling with the diplomatic language required to explain the situation. "And the foundation meeting? The board members have traveled from various parts of the country specifically for today's session. The same explanation will have to suffice," Isabella replied, though each cancellation felt like a small betrayal of the trust people had placed in her. "Please ensure that all necessary materials are distributed to the board members so they can proceed with any urgent business that doesn't require my direct input." As Eleanor worked through the list of affected appointments and engagements, Isabella reflected on the broader implications of Lady Beatrice's actions. The Queen Consort had successfully asserted her authority, but at what cost? The charitable organizations that depended on royal patronage would begin to question the reliability of their support. The hospital staff would need to explain to disappointed children why their anticipated visitor couldn't come. The foundation board would wonder if their patron was truly committed to their cause. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, Lady Beatrice was discovering that her moment of triumph was bringing unexpected consequences. Her private secretary, Mr. Jonathan Pierce, had arrived with his own tablet full of increasingly urgent messages from various organizations and media outlets seeking clarification about the sudden changes to Princess Isabella's schedule. "Your Majesty," Jonathan said carefully, "the palace press office is receiving numerous inquiries about Princess Isabella's canceled appointments. They're asking for guidance on how to respond to media questions." Lady Beatrice waved her hand dismissively. "Tell them that Princess Isabella is taking a personal day for family matters. That should satisfy their curiosity." Jonathan hesitated before continuing. "The challenge is that several of these events were scheduled weeks in advance and involve significant charitable commitments. The optics of sudden cancellations could be problematic, particularly given the current public interest in the transition of roles within the royal family." The phrase hung in the air like an unspoken criticism. Lady Beatrice felt her earlier satisfaction beginning to erode as the practical implications of her decision became clearer. She had wanted to assert her authority over Isabella, but she hadn't fully considered how that assertion might be perceived by the outside world. Back in Isabella's quarters, the afternoon was progressing with an surreal quality. Isabella had maintained her daily routines as much as possible, reading briefing papers for future engagements, reviewing correspondence from various charitable organizations, and working on a speech she was scheduled to deliver the following week. The normalcy of these activities contrasted sharply with the abnormality of her confinement. Mrs. Hartwell had remained in the room, partly to assist with rescheduling and correspondence, but also because she seemed reluctant to leave Isabella alone under such unusual circumstances. The two women had developed a strong working relationship over the years, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to Isabella's charitable work. "Your Royal Highness," Eleanor said during a brief pause in their work, "if I may speak freely, the staff throughout the palace seems quite concerned about today's developments. Many are asking questions that I'm not sure how to answer." Isabella looked up from the speech she had been editing. "What kinds of questions?" "They're wondering about the hierarchy of authority, about how decisions regarding royal schedules are made, and frankly about whether this situation might become a regular occurrence." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen many changes in royal households, but had never witnessed anything quite like this. Isabella set down her papers and considered her response carefully. The staff's concerns were valid and reflected broader questions about how the royal family would function going forward. "Please assure everyone that this is an isolated incident related to specific circumstances. The normal protocols and schedules will resume shortly." But even as she said the words, Isabella wondered if they were true. Lady Beatrice had crossed a significant line today, and there was no guarantee she wouldn't cross it again if she felt her authority was being challenged. As the afternoon progressed, word of Isabella's confinement began to spread beyond the immediate palace staff. In the age of social media and instant communication, it was nearly impossible to keep such developments completely private, especially when they involved canceled public appearances and rescheduled charitable events. The first hints appeared on royal watching blogs and social media accounts that closely monitored the activities of the royal family. Comments began appearing about the sudden nature of Princess Isabella's canceled appointments, with speculation ranging from health concerns to family conflicts. The palace press office found itself in the difficult position of managing inquiries without having clear guidance on how much information to reveal. James Whitmore, the chief communications officer for the royal household, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. He had served the royal family through various challenges and controversies, but the current situation presented unique difficulties. He couldn't provide a health-related explanation without medical justification, but he also couldn't reveal the true nature of the conflict without potentially damaging the reputation of both women involved. His solution was to issue a brief statement indicating that Princess Isabella's afternoon engagements have been postponed due to urgent family considerations, and new dates will be announced shortly. The statement was technically accurate but sufficiently vague to avoid revealing the underlying tension. However, the vagueness of the statement only served to fuel more speculation. Royal reporters, who had been following the dynamics between Lady Beatrice and Princess Isabella for months, began to connect dots and develop theories about what might have occurred. In the early evening, as the palace prepared for dinner service, an unexpected visitor arrived at Princess Isabella's quarters. Prince Edward himself, Lady Beatrice's husband and Isabella's former brother-in-law, knocked gently on the door. His presence indicated that news of the day's events had reached the highest levels of the royal family. Isabella opened the door to find Edward looking unusually serious, his typical jovial demeanor replaced by concern and confusion. They had maintained a cordial relationship since his marriage to Beatrice, built on years of family connection and mutual respect. "Isabella," he said quietly, "may I come in? I think we need to discuss what happened today." Isabella stepped aside to allow him entry, noting that the guards in the corridor acknowledged the prince, but made no move to prevent his visit. Apparently, Lady Beatrice's orders regarding Isabella's confinement didn't extend to restricting visits from other family members. "I've been receiving reports about canceled appointments and some kind of disagreement between you and Beatrice," Edward continued as he entered the sitting area. "I'm hoping you can help me understand what occurred." Isabella gestured for him to sit, then took a seat across from him. The conversation that was about to unfold would require careful navigation, as she needed to be honest about the situation, while avoiding any appearance of trying to undermine Edward's marriage. "There was indeed a disagreement," Isabella began carefully. "Beatrice expressed concerns about my involvement in the charity gala planning and felt that my input was undermining her authority." The conversation became heated, and she ultimately asked Captain Morrison to ensure that I remained in my quarters for the remainder of the day. Edward's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, confusion, and what appeared to be embarrassment.
She asked you to remain in your quarters, like, confined you? That would be an accurate description of the situation, Isabella confirmed, her voice remaining neutral despite the unusual nature of the conversation. Edward ran his hand through his hair, a gesture Isabella remembered from their younger days when he was grappling with difficult royal duties.
Isabella, I had no idea about any of this. Beatrice mentioned that you had discussed the charity gala, but she described it as a productive conversation about dividing responsibilities. The revelation that Lady Beatrice had presented a completely different version of events to her husband added another layer of complexity to the situation. Isabella found herself in the uncomfortable position of contradicting Edward's wife while trying to maintain family relationships. Perhaps Beatrice genuinely saw it that way. Isabella replied diplomatically. Perspectives on the same conversation can sometimes differ significantly. Edward studied Isabella's face, clearly trying to read between the lines of her carefully chosen words. His experience with royal diplomacy told him that there was much more to the story than what was being explicitly stated. The cancelled appointments have created some challenges, he said. The press office has been fielding questions all afternoon, and I understand that several charitable organizations are concerned about the sudden changes. I've been working with Eleanor to reschedule everything as quickly as possible. Most organizations are understanding about family emergencies, though obviously the children at the hospital were disappointed. The mention of disappointed children seemed to particularly affect Edward. One of his strongest qualities as a royal had always been his genuine care for the public welfare and his understanding of how royal actions affected ordinary people. This situation cannot continue, he said finally. Regardless of whatever disagreements exist between you and Beatrice, the public commitments of the royal family must be honored. We cannot have appointments cancelled arbitrarily due to personal conflicts. Isabella appreciated his recognition of the broader implications, but she was also aware that resolving the situation would require more than just Edward's good intentions. I agree completely. However, the solution will need to address Beatrice's concerns about authority and boundaries while ensuring that charitable commitments can be fulfilled reliably. Edward stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens as Isabella had done earlier. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the carefully maintained grounds, creating a peaceful scene that contrasted sharply with the tension within the palace walls. I need to speak with Beatrice, he said finally. This morning's incident cannot be repeated, and we need to establish clear protocols for how disagreements will be handled in the future. Isabella felt a mixture of relief and apprehension about Edward's intended conversation with his wife. While she welcomed his intervention, she was also concerned about how Lady Beatrice might react to what could be perceived as taking Isabella's side in their conflict. Edward, she said carefully, please understand that I never intended to undermine Beatrice's authority. If my continued involvement in charitable activities is problematic, perhaps we need to restructure responsibilities more clearly. Edward turned from the window to face her. Isabella, you've dedicated years of your life to building relationships with charitable organizations and serving the public. That work shouldn't be discarded because of personality conflicts or authority disputes. We need to find a way for everyone to work together effectively. After Edward left to find his wife, Isabella was once again alone with her thoughts. The intervention of the prince gave her hope that the situation might be resolved, but she was also realistic about the challenges ahead. Lady Beatrice's actions had been driven by deep-seated insecurities and frustrations that wouldn't disappear overnight. Mrs. Hartwell returned with dinner on a silver tray, a routine that felt both normal and surreal given the circumstances. Your Royal Highness, the kitchen staff wanted to ensure you had your usual evening meal. They also asked me to convey their support during this difficult time. The message from the kitchen staff was touching, but also concerning. If even the domestic staff were aware of the conflict and felt compelled to choose sides, the situation was more serious than Isabella had hoped. As the evening progressed, Isabella could occasionally hear voices from other parts of the palace, conversations that seemed more intense than the usual dinner-hour discussions. She suspected that Edward was indeed having his promised conversation with Lady Beatrice, and possibly with other senior members of the royal household as well. The guards remained stationed outside her door, a constant reminder of her unusual status within the palace. They had been professional and respectful throughout the day, but Isabella could sense their discomfort with the assignment. Confining a member of the royal family was outside their normal duties, and put them in an awkward position regarding their loyalties and responsibilities. As night fell over the palace, Isabella prepared for bed with the strange knowledge that tomorrow would bring either a resolution to the conflict or an escalation of the tensions that had erupted that morning. The comfortable routines of her evening preparations couldn't mask the underlying uncertainty about what her role in the royal family would look like going forward. The day had begun with a simple disagreement about flower arrangements, and had evolved into a fundamental question about power, respect, and the future dynamics of the royal household. Isabella had found herself at the center of a conflict that she had never wanted and had tried to avoid, but which now seemed to require a clear resolution. In her final thoughts before sleep, Isabella reflected on the irony of her situation. She had spent years serving the public and supporting charitable causes, always trying to use her position for positive impact. Now she found herself confined to her room, unable to fulfill the very commitments that had defined her royal service. The ornate clock on her mantelpiece chimed midnight, marking the end of one of the most unusual days in her royal experience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and hopefully new opportunities for resolution. But the events of this day had fundamentally changed the dynamics within the palace walls. As Isabella finally settled into bed, she could only hope that the morning would bring wisdom, understanding, and a path forward that would allow all members of the royal family to serve the public effectively while maintaining their personal dignity and family relationships. The morning light that filtered through the heavy curtains of Lady Beatrice's bedroom seemed harsh and unforgiving, as she slowly awakened to the reality of the previous day's events. Her conversation with Prince Edward the night before had been intense and uncomfortable, forcing her to confront the full implications of her decision to confine Princess Isabella to her quarters. Edward had been diplomatic but firm in his concerns about the cancelled charitable commitments and the potential damage to the royal family's reputation. He had listened to Beatrice's explanation of her frustrations with Isabella's perceived interference, but his questions had made it clear that he viewed her actions as disproportionate to the perceived offense. "Beatrice," he had said during their late-night discussion, "I understand that the transition has been difficult and that you feel overshadowed at times. But confining Isabella to her quarters creates problems that extend far beyond any personal disagreements between you two." Beatrice had tried to explain her perspective, the constant comparisons, the feeling that the staff preferred Isabella's approach, the sense that her authority was being undermined at every turn. Edward had listened sympathetically, but his responses made it clear that he believed the situation required a different approach. Now, as she prepared for the day, Beatrice found herself dreading the conversations and meetings that lay ahead. The palace press office had scheduled a briefing to discuss the previous day's cancelled events and to plan for managing any media inquiries. Additionally, several senior staff members had requested meetings to discuss protocol and scheduling concerns. Margaret Thornfield, Beatrice's lady-in-waiting, entered the room with the morning's correspondence and a carefully neutral expression. Margaret had been navigating royal households for decades and had developed a talent for remaining diplomatically neutral during family conflicts. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Margaret said, placing the silver tray of letters and newspapers on the side table. "Your first appointment this morning is with Mr. Whitmore from the Communications Office, followed by a meeting with the Charity Coordination Committee." Beatrice noted that Margaret's tone was more formal than usual, lacking the warmth that had developed over their months of working together. The change was subtle but unmistakable, and it suggested that even her closest staff were uncomfortable with the previous day's events. "Have there been any developments regarding Princess Isabella?" Beatrice asked, trying to sound casual while clearly seeking information about whether the confinement was still in effect. Margaret hesitated slightly before responding. "Captain Morrison has indicated that the security arrangements from yesterday remain in place pending further instructions from Your Majesty." The formal phrasing made it clear that the decision to continue or end Isabella's confinement rested entirely with Beatrice. This authority, which had felt empowering the previous day, now felt like a burden that was becoming heavier with each passing hour. Meanwhile, in Isabella's quarters, the morning brought its own set of challenges and considerations. She had awakened to find the guards still stationed outside her door. confirming that her confinement had extended overnight. Mrs. Hartwell arrived early with breakfast and an updated list of appointments that needed to be rescheduled or canceled. "Your Royal Highness," Eleanor said as she reviewed her tablet, "the situation is becoming increasingly complex from a scheduling perspective. Several organizations have expressed concern about the reliability of future commitments, and some are requesting meetings to discuss alternative arrangements." Isabella understood the implications immediately. If charitable organizations began to doubt the dependability of royal patronage, it could damage relationships that had taken years to build. The work she had done to strengthen these partnerships was at risk of being undone by the current conflict. "What about the media attention?" Isabella asked, knowing that the canceled appointments would inevitably attract journalistic interest. Eleanor's expression grew more serious. "There's been some speculation on social media and royal watching blogs. Mr. Whitmore's office has been monitoring the situation closely, but they're reporting that interest is growing rather than diminishing." The prospect of media scrutiny added another layer of urgency to resolving the situation. Royal family conflicts that became public knowledge could damage the monarchy's reputation and distract from important charitable and state functions. Isabella made a decision that would prove to be significant. "Eleanor, I want you to prepare a comprehensive briefing on all my current charitable commitments, upcoming events, and the potential impact of continued disruptions. If this situation is going to be resolved, everyone involved needs to understand the full scope of what's at stake." While Isabella was preparing her briefing, Lady Beatrice was beginning her morning meetings with a growing sense of unease. James Whitmore, the chief communications officer, had arrived with concerns that extended beyond simple media management. "Your Majesty," Whitmore began, "we're receiving inquiries not just about yesterday's canceled events, but about the broader question of how royal duties are being coordinated. Some reporters are beginning to speculate about tensions within the family." Beatrice felt a chill run through her as she realized that her private conflict with Isabella was threatening to become public knowledge. "What kind of speculation are we seeing?" "Nothing too specific yet," Whitmore replied, "but there are questions about the decision-making process for royal schedules and whether there might be disagreements about roles and responsibilities. We need to be prepared with consistent messaging if these inquiries intensify." The meeting continued with discussions about potential responses to various scenarios, but Beatrice found it difficult to focus on the strategic communications planning when the underlying problem remained unresolved. She was beginning to understand that her actions had created a situation that could spiral beyond her control if not addressed promptly. Later that morning, the Charity Coordination Committee meeting provided another perspective on the developing crisis. The committee, composed of senior palace staff responsible for managing royal charitable activities, had serious concerns about the previous day's events and their potential impact on long-term relationships with charitable organizations. Lord Pemberton, who served as the Director of Royal Charitable Activities, spoke for the committee when he addressed Lady Beatrice directly. "Your Majesty, we appreciate the complex dynamics involved in coordinating royal duties among multiple family members. However, the sudden cancellation of established commitments creates significant challenges for the organizations that depend on royal support." He continued with specific examples of the impact from the previous day's cancellations. The Children's Hospital had prepared special activities and decorations for Princess Isabella's visit. The Foundation Board meeting included members who had traveled internationally specifically for the session. These aren't simply scheduling inconveniences. They represent real costs and disappointments for organizations that are already operating with limited resources. Lady Beatrice listened to the detailed explanation of consequences she hadn't fully considered. Her decision to confine Isabella had been driven by personal frustration and a desire to assert authority, but she was beginning to understand the broader implications of her actions. "What do you recommend going forward?" she asked, genuinely seeking guidance from people who understood the charitable sector better than she did. Lord Pemberton exchanged glances with other committee members before responding. "We believe it's essential to restore confidence in the reliability of royal commitments. This might require not just rescheduling the canceled events, but also providing additional assurances about future scheduling coordination." The message was diplomatic but clear. The current situation was damaging relationships that were crucial to the royal family's charitable mission, and it needed to be resolved quickly. While these meetings were taking place, Prince Edward was dealing with his own set of challenges related to the previous day's events. His private secretary had briefed him on the various inquiries and concerns that were arising from different quarters: staff concerns about authority and decision-making, media interest in the cancelled events, and private communications from charitable organizations seeking clarification about future royal support. Edward realized that the conflict between his wife and Isabella had escalated beyond a simple personal disagreement. It was now affecting the operational effectiveness of the royal household and potentially threatening the monarchy's charitable mission. He made the decision to convene an emergency meeting with the senior members of the household staff to address the situation directly. This meeting, held in the king's private study, included Captain Morrison, James Whitmore, Lord Pemberton, and several other key figures in palace operations. "I want to be clear about the purpose of this meeting," Edward began. "We have a situation that is affecting our ability to fulfill our public duties and maintain our charitable commitments. I need to understand the full scope of the problem and develop a plan to resolve it immediately." Captain Morrison was the first to speak, addressing the security and protocol aspects of the situation. "Your Majesty, the current arrangement regarding Princess Isabella's confinement is creating operational difficulties for the security team. We're unclear about the duration and scope of these restrictions, which makes it difficult to plan for normal palace operations." James Whitmore followed with his communications concerns. "From a media perspective, we're in an increasingly precarious position. The longer this situation continues, the more likely it becomes that the full details will become public knowledge. We need to resolve this before it becomes a major news story." Lord Pemberton emphasized the charitable implications once again. The royal family's relationship with the charitable sector is built on trust and reliability. Each day this continues increases the risk of long-term damage to these relationships. Prince Edward listened carefully to each perspective, recognizing that he was facing a crisis that required immediate resolution. The personal conflict between Beatrice and Isabella had grown into an institutional challenge that threatened core functions of the monarchy. "I want to propose a solution," Edward said finally, "but it will require cooperation from all parties involved, including my wife and Princess Isabella." He outlined a plan that involved an immediate end to Isabella's confinement, a structured meeting between the two women to address their concerns directly, and the development of new protocols for coordinating royal duties and charitable activities. The plan also included a comprehensive review of scheduling and decision-making processes to prevent similar conflicts in the future. "This approach requires everyone to set aside personal grievances in favor of our public responsibilities," Edward continued. "The charitable organizations that depend on us, the staff members who work to support our mission, and the public that funds our activities all deserve better than what happened yesterday." While Edward was conducting his meeting with senior staff, Isabella was using her time in confinement to develop her own proposals for resolving the conflict. Working with Mrs. Hartwell, she had created a detailed analysis of her charitable commitments and a proposed restructuring of responsibilities that might address Lady Beatrice's concerns about authority and territory. Isabella's approach was characteristically thoughtful and diplomatic. Rather than focusing on blame or personal grievances, she had concentrated on practical solutions that could benefit everyone involved. Her proposals included clear delineation of charitable responsibilities, regular coordination meetings to prevent scheduling conflicts, and a gradual transition of certain activities to allow Lady Beatrice to establish her own charitable identity. "The goal," Isabella explained to Eleanor, "is to create a structure that allows both of us to serve effectively without stepping on each other's territories or creating confusion among the organizations we support." Isabella's proposals demonstrated her understanding that the current situation required more than just an apology or a return to the previous status quo. She recognized that Lady Beatrice's concerns about being overshadowed were legitimate, even if the method chosen to address them had been problematic. As the afternoon approached, all parties were preparing for what would likely be a decisive conversation about the future of royal household operations. Prince Edward had scheduled a meeting for later that day that would include himself, Lady Beatrice, Princess Isabella, and several key staff members. The meeting would need to address not just the immediate crisis of Isabella's confinement, but also the underlying tensions and structural problems that had led to the conflict. Success would require maturity, compromise, and a shared commitment to the royal family's public mission from all participants. The stakes were high. Failure to resolve the situation effectively could result in continued operational dysfunction, damage to charitable relationships, negative media attention, and potential long-term harm to the monarchy's reputation and effectiveness. As the key players prepared for this crucial meeting, each was wrestling with their own perspectives on what had gone wrong and what needed to change. The conversation ahead would require them to move beyond personal grievances and focus on solutions that could restore stability and effectiveness to the royal household. The beautiful palace, with its centuries of history and tradition, had seen many conflicts and challenges over the years, but the current situation was unique in its combination of personal dynamics, institutional responsibilities, and public accountability. The resolution would need to honor all these elements while creating a sustainable path forward. In just a few hours, the fate of both the immediate crisis and the long-term effectiveness of the royal household would likely be determined by the willingness of all parties to prioritize their public duties over their personal differences. The afternoon sun cast long rectangles of light across the polished mahogany table in the king's private study, as the most crucial meeting in recent royal family history was about to begin. Prince Edward had chosen this intimate space rather than a formal conference room, hoping that the personal atmosphere might encourage honest dialogue rather than defensive posturing. Captain Morrison had finally received word that Princess Isabella's confinement would be lifted for the duration of the meeting, though the underlying authority for her movement remained unclear. As Isabella made her way from her quarters to the king's study, she passed familiar staff members who offered supportive smiles and subtle nods of encouragement. The palace community had clearly been affected by the previous day's events. Lady Beatrice arrived at the study first, accompanied by her private secretary, Mr. Farah Pierce, who would be taking notes for the record. She had spent considerable time preparing for this meeting, knowing that her handling of the situation would likely determine not just the immediate resolution, but also her long-term effectiveness as queen consort. Beatrice had experienced a range of emotions since the previous day's confrontation: satisfaction at having asserted her authority, frustration that her actions were being questioned, concern about the broader implications, and growing uncertainty about whether her approach had been appropriate. The meetings with palace staff had made it clear that her actions had consequences extending far beyond her personal relationship with Isabella. When Isabella entered the study, the tension in the room was immediately palpable. She nodded politely to Lady Beatrice, who returned the gesture with equal formality. Both women were clearly prepared for a difficult conversation, but their body language suggested very different emotional states. Isabella appeared calm and composed, while Beatrice seemed defensive and somewhat anxious. Prince Edward began the meeting by acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. "We're here to address what happened yesterday and to develop a path forward that serves the interests of the royal family, our charitable partners, and the public we serve." He continued by outlining the various concerns that had been raised by palace staff, charitable organizations, and the communications office. The cancelled appointments, the confusion about authority and decision-making, and the potential for media scrutiny were all factors that needed to be addressed immediately. "Before we discuss solutions," Edward said, looking directly at his wife, "I think we need to understand what led to yesterday's events. Beatrice, would you like to explain your perspective on what occurred?" Lady Beatrice had rehearsed this moment, but found herself struggling to articulate her feelings in a way that would justify her actions. "I've been feeling increasingly frustrated by what I perceive as undermining of my authority," she began. "Every time I try to implement changes or establish my own approach to royal duties, I encounter resistance or suggestions for alternative approaches that make me feel incompetent," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to her theme. "The charity gala was supposed to be my opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities, but instead I found that decisions I had made were being quietly changed without my consultation. When I confronted Isabella about this, the conversation became heated, and I felt that decisive action was necessary to establish clear boundaries." Isabella listened without interruption, though Edward could see her occasionally making small notes on a pad of paper she had brought with her. When Beatrice finished her explanation, Edward turned to Isabella for her perspective on the events. "I appreciate Beatrice's honesty about her frustrations," Isabella began diplomatically. "I want to be clear that I never intended to undermine her authority or make her feel incompetent. When the florist contacted me about the charity gala arrangements, I provided suggestions based on past experience, not realizing that these would be implemented without consulting Beatrice first." Isabella continued with a more detailed explanation of her involvement in the gala planning. My interactions with palace staff have been guided by the same principles I've always followed, being helpful when asked and sharing knowledge that might be useful. However, I can see how this might be interpreted as interference, particularly during a transition period when new procedures are being established. Edward appreciated Isabella's measured response, but he was also aware that the explanation highlighted a significant problem in how the palace was managing the transition of roles and responsibilities. The staff members who had naturally turned to Isabella for guidance hadn't been properly instructed about new reporting structures and decision-making hierarchies. It seems to me, Edward said, that we have both a personal conflict and a systemic problem. The personal issues between you two need to be resolved, but we also need to establish clear protocols that prevent similar confusion in the future. He then invited both women to share their ideas for moving forward. Isabella was prepared with her comprehensive analysis of charitable responsibilities and proposed restructuring of duties. She presented a detailed plan that would clearly delineate areas of responsibility, establish regular coordination meetings, and create a gradual transition process for certain charitable patronages. The goal, Isabella explained, is to create a structure where we can both serve effectively without confusion about roles or territories. Some organizations might benefit from joint patronage, others might be better served by a single point of contact, and new initiatives could be developed specifically for Beatrice to establish her own charitable identity. Lady Beatrice listened to Isabella's proposals with mixed feelings. On one hand, the structured approach addressed many of her concerns about clarity and authority. On the other hand, she was frustrated that Isabella had once again demonstrated superior preparation and strategic thinking, making Beatrice feel inadequate by comparison. These suggestions seem reasonable, Beatrice said carefully. But I'm concerned about the implementation. How do we ensure that the theoretical division of responsibilities translates into actual practice, particularly given the staff's tendency to seek Isabella's input regardless of official protocols? That's exactly the kind of systemic issue we need to address, he said. We need to retrain staff on new procedures and create accountability mechanisms to ensure that protocols are followed consistently. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, covering various aspects of the conflict and potential solutions. They discussed media management strategies, staff training protocols, and methods for rebuilding relationships with affected charitable organizations. Both women made concessions and compromises, though the underlying tensions were still evident. As the meeting progressed, Mr. Pierce and Mrs. Hartwell, who had joined to provide administrative support, were taking detailed notes that would become the basis for new operating procedures. The level of detail required for implementation was extensive, covering everything from staff reporting structures to media coordination protocols. One of the most significant developments in the meeting was Lady Beatrice's acknowledgement that her decision to confine Isabella had been disproportionate and problematic. I realized that my actions yesterday created problems that extended far beyond our personal disagreement, she said. I was focused on asserting my authority but didn't fully consider the broader implications for our charitable commitments and public duties. Isabella accepted the acknowledgement graciously, though she also emphasized the importance of ensuring that such actions couldn't be repeated. We need safeguards that prevent personal conflicts from interfering with our public responsibilities, she said. The organizations and people we serve deserve consistency and reliability, regardless of any disagreements we might have. Prince Edward proposed the establishment of a formal royal duties coordination committee that would include both women along with senior staff members. This committee would meet weekly to coordinate schedules, resolve conflicts, and ensure that charitable commitments were being met effectively. The committee would also have authority to mediate disputes and prevent unilateral decisions that could affect multiple family members. As the meeting drew toward a close, Edward addressed the immediate practical issues that needed resolution. Isabella's confinement would end immediately, the cancelled appointments would be rescheduled as quickly as possible, and a joint statement would be prepared to address any media inquiries about the previous day's events. I want to be clear about my expectations going forward, Edward said, looking at both women. Personal disagreements are inevitable in any family, but they cannot be allowed to interfere with our public duties. The approach we've developed today provides a framework for managing conflicts constructively rather than destructively. He continued with specific expectations for each woman. Lady Beatrice would have clear authority over designated charitable areas and would take the lead on specific types of events. Isabella would continue her established charitable work while being mindful of coordination requirements and Beatrice's role as queen consort. Both women agreed to the proposed structure, though their responses suggested different levels of enthusiasm. Isabella seemed genuinely relieved to have a clear framework that would allow her to continue her charitable work while addressing Beatrice's concerns. Beatrice appeared more cautious, perhaps still uncertain about whether the new arrangements would actually resolve the underlying tensions. The meeting concluded with a discussion of immediate next steps. Captain Morrison was tasked with briefing the security team on the new protocols and ensuring that normal palace operations could resume. James Whitmore would prepare communication strategies for managing any remaining media interest in the previous day's events. Lord Pemberton would begin reaching out to affected charitable organizations to reschedule events and provide assurance about future reliability. As the participants prepared to leave the study, Prince Edward asked for a few moments alone with his wife and Isabella. The formal portions of the meeting were complete, but he felt that a more personal conversation was necessary to address the emotional aspects of the conflict. "I want both of you to understand that this situation has been difficult for everyone involved," Edward began. "The palace staff, the charitable organizations, and the public all depend on us to work together effectively. What happened yesterday shook confidence in our ability to fulfill our responsibilities." He turned to Lady Beatrice first. "Beatrice, your frustrations about authority and recognition are understandable, and we need to do a better job of supporting your transition into this role. However, the method you chose to address those frustrations created serious problems that we're still working to resolve. Isabella, your experience and established relationships are valuable assets, but we need to ensure that your continued involvement doesn't inadvertently undermine Beatrice's authority or create confusion about roles." Both women acknowledged his points, though the conversation remained somewhat formal and cautious. The personal relationship between Beatrice and Isabella would clearly require more time and effort to repair, even if the professional structures could be established more quickly. As they prepared to leave the study, Isabella made a gesture that surprised everyone in the room. She turned to Lady Beatrice and extended her hand. "I hope we can work together more effectively going forward," she said. "Our personal differences shouldn't prevent us from serving the causes we both care about." Lady Beatrice hesitated for a moment before accepting the handshake. "I agree," she said, though her tone suggested some remaining reservations. "The structure we've developed today should help us avoid future conflicts." The handshake was brief and somewhat formal, but it represented a symbolic commitment to moving forward despite the underlying tensions. Edward observed the exchange with cautious optimism, recognizing that rebuilding trust and cooperation would be a gradual process requiring ongoing effort from all parties. As the three of them left the king's study together, palace staff throughout the building were waiting for news about the resolution of the crisis. The previous day's events had created uncertainty and concern among employees who were dedicated to supporting the royal family's mission but had been caught in the middle of a personal conflict. The immediate crisis was over. Isabella's confinement had been lifted, new protocols had been established, and a framework for coordination had been developed. However, the real test would be whether the theoretical solutions could be translated into effective practice and whether the personal relationships could be repaired sufficiently to support long-term collaboration. The late afternoon sun was setting over the palace grounds as the participants in this historic meeting went their separate ways to begin implementing the solutions they had developed. The day that had begun with tension and uncertainty was ending with hope for a better path forward, though everyone involved understood that the real work was just beginning. The framework they had created was comprehensive and thoughtful, but its success would depend on the willingness of all parties to honor their commitments and work together, despite their personal differences. The royal family's ability to serve the public effectively hung in the balance, awaiting the test of real-world implementation. 3 weeks had passed since the historic meeting in Prince Edward's study, and the implementation of the new protocols was being tested by the daily realities of royal life. The carefully crafted agreements and structures that had seemed so promising during their negotiations were now facing the challenges of practical application, human nature, and the complex dynamics of a centuries-old institution. The first Royal Duties Coordination Committee meeting had taken place exactly 1 week after the resolution meeting. The atmosphere had been professional but noticeably tense, with both Lady Beatrice and Princess Isabella approaching their interactions with careful formality. Mrs. Hartwell and Mr. Pierce had prepared comprehensive briefings on upcoming events, scheduling considerations, and coordination requirements. Lord Pemberton had presented a detailed report on the impact of the cancelled appointments from 3 weeks earlier. While most charitable organizations had been understanding about the family emergency, some had expressed concerns about reliability that would require ongoing attention. 2 organizations had requested meetings to discuss backup protocols for future events, and 1 had inquired about alternative royal patronage arrangements. The feedback has been largely positive regarding our response and rescheduling efforts, Lord Pemberton had reported. But we're seeing some residual concern about the dependability of royal commitments. This will require consistent follow-through over the coming months to fully restore confidence. Lady Beatrice had taken notes during the presentation, recognizing that her actions had created a problem that would require sustained effort to resolve. The charitable sector's concerns weren't just about the specific cancelled events. They reflected broader questions about the stability and reliability of royal support during what was clearly a transition period. The committee meeting had proceeded through various agenda items, including the upcoming Children's Charity Gala that had been at the center of the original conflict. Under the new protocols, Lady Beatrice retained primary authority over the event, but regular coordination checkpoints ensured that all relevant information was shared and potential conflicts were identified early. Isabella had contributed to the planning discussions when asked, but had been careful to frame her input as suggestions rather than directives. The dynamic was still somewhat artificial, but both women were making visible efforts to work within the new framework. Following the committee meeting, Captain Morrison had briefed the security team on the new protocols and coordination requirements. The guards who had been involved in Isabella's confinement had received additional training on authority structures and proper procedures for handling unusual requests from royal family members. The situation 3 weeks ago placed our team in a difficult position, Captain Morrison had explained to his staff. We need clear protocols for situations where family members give conflicting instructions or when requests fall outside normal security parameters. The new security protocols included requirements for written confirmation of any unusual restrictions on royal family members and a clear chain of command for resolving conflicts between different royals' instructions. The goal was to prevent security staff from being caught between competing authorities or being asked to implement decisions that might be problematic. Meanwhile, the palace press office had been managing ongoing media interest in the royal family dynamics. James Whitmore had developed a comprehensive communication strategy that emphasized the positive aspects of the new coordination structures while deflecting inquiries about the specific events that had led to their implementation. We're positioning this as a natural evolution of royal duties coordination, Whitmore had explained to his team. The focus is on improved efficiency and better service to charitable partners, not on resolving conflicts. The media strategy was largely successful in the first few weeks, with most coverage focusing on upcoming royal events rather than speculation about family tensions. However, Whitmore remained aware that any future incidents could reignite interest in the underlying dynamics. The real test of the new arrangements came during the Children's Charity Gala, which took place exactly 3 weeks after the original conflict. Lady Beatrice had thrown herself into the planning with determination to prove that she could manage a major royal event successfully without creating the kinds of problems that had emerged previously. The gala was held at the grand ballroom of the palace, with over 300 guests representing various children's charities and their major donors. Lady Beatrice had worked closely with the event planning team to ensure that every detail reflected her vision, while incorporating the practical lessons learned from previous similar events. Princess Isabella attended the gala as a guest rather than as a co-host, arrangement that had been carefully negotiated during the coordination committee meetings. Her presence demonstrated family unity while respecting Lady Beatrice's authority over the event. Isabella's behavior during the gala was a masterclass in royal diplomacy. She was gracious and engaged with the charitable representatives, but consistently deferred to Lady Beatrice as the evening's host. The event was widely regarded as a success, raising significant funds for children's charities and generating positive media coverage for the royal family's charitable work. More importantly for the ongoing family dynamics, Lady Beatrice had demonstrated her capability to manage a complex royal event effectively, addressing some of the insecurities that had contributed to the original conflict. During her speech at the gala, Lady Beatrice had made specific reference to the importance of collaboration and coordination in charitable work. The challenges facing children today require all of us to work together effectively, setting aside personal differences in favor of our shared mission, she had said, words that many attendees interpreted as having significance beyond the charitable context. After the gala's success, the atmosphere during the second Coordination Committee meeting was noticeably more relaxed. Both women seemed more confident in their roles within the new structure, and their interactions showed signs of developing into a more natural working relationship. However, challenges remained. During the second meeting, a scheduling conflict arose regarding an international development conference where both women had been invited to participate. The conference organizers had extended separate invitations without realizing the potential for coordination issues within the royal family. Lady Beatrice's initial reaction was to assert her priority for the invitation, viewing it as an opportunity to establish her credentials in international charitable work. Isabella, however, had been working with the conference organizers for over a year and had helped develop the agenda for the sessions on education initiatives. The discussion of how to handle the conference invitations revealed that the underlying tensions hadn't been fully resolved, despite the new protocols. Both women still felt competitive about opportunities and recognition, even though they were now operating within a more structured framework. Prince Edward, who had been attending the coordination meetings as an observer, intervened when the discussion about the conference began to show signs of escalating into another conflict. "This is exactly the kind of situation the new protocols were designed to address," he said firmly. "We need to make decisions based on expertise, existing relationships, and strategic impact, rather than on personal preferences or authority claims." After discussion, the committee decided that both women would attend different aspects of the conference, with Isabella leading the education sessions and Lady Beatrice participating in the economic development panels. The solution required additional coordination and resources, but it demonstrated that conflicts could be resolved constructively within the new framework. The conference attendance arrangement worked well in practice, with both women contributing effectively to their respective sessions. The international charitable community responded positively to seeing multiple members of the royal family engaged in global development issues, and the media coverage emphasized the breadth of royal family commitment to international causes. More importantly for the family dynamics, the successful resolution of the conference scheduling conflict showed that the new protocols could handle real disagreements without escalating into personal confrontations. Both women had been required to compromise, but the outcome had been beneficial for everyone involved. As the weeks continued, other tests of the new arrangements arose. A major donor to one of Isabella's longtime charitable projects requested a private meeting to discuss concerns about the organization's direction. Under the old informal arrangements, Isabella would have handled the meeting independently. Under the new protocols, she needed to coordinate with Lady Beatrice since the donor was also considering support for other royal charitable initiatives. The coordination process was initially awkward, with both women unsure about the appropriate level of information sharing and consultation. However, the meeting ultimately went well, with the donor expressing appreciation for the royal family's organized approach to charitable coordination. These small successes began to build confidence in the new system and gradually reduce the tension between the two women. While they were far from becoming close friends, their working relationship was developing into something more productive and less fraught with competition. The palace staff, who had been most affected by the uncertainty and conflict of the previous period, began to express greater confidence in the new arrangements. Mrs. Hartwell and Mr. Pierce, whose roles had evolved to include more coordination responsibilities, reported that their work was becoming more efficient and less stressful. "The clear protocols have eliminated much of the guesswork that was creating problems," Mrs. Hartwell reported during a staff meeting. "When everyone understands the decision-making process and communication requirements, we can focus on supporting the charitable work rather than managing conflicts." Captain Morrison had similar positive feedback about the security implications of the new protocols. "The clearer authority structures and coordination requirements have eliminated the kinds of situations that put security staff in difficult positions. he reported. "We now have clear procedures for handling unusual requests and resolving conflicts." The media coverage of royal activities had also stabilized, with reporters focusing on the charitable work and public events rather than speculating about family tensions. James Whitmore's communication strategy was proving effective in presenting a unified and competent royal family to the public. However, the most significant development was the gradual evolution of the personal relationship between Lady Beatrice and Princess Isabella. While they were unlikely to become close friends, their interactions were becoming more natural and less defensive. The success of their collaborative efforts was building mutual respect, even if personal warmth remained limited. During the third Coordination Committee meeting, an observer would have noticed small but meaningful changes in their dynamic. End of quote. They were making eye contact more naturally, occasionally building on each other's ideas and showing signs of developing an effective professional partnership. The conversation had shifted from defensive territory protection to collaborative problem-solving. When discussing an upcoming state dinner with charitable components, both women contributed ideas that built on each other's expertise rather than competing for control. As the meeting concluded, Lady Beatrice made an observation that surprised everyone present. "I think we're finding a rhythm that works," she said, looking directly at Isabella. "It's different from what either of us probably expected, but it seems to be effective." Isabella nodded in agreement. "The structure has helped us focus on what we're trying to accomplish rather than on personal concerns," she replied. "The charitable organizations are getting better support, and we're both able to contribute in ways that match our strengths." Prince Edward, who had been watching the evolution of their relationship with cautious optimism, felt genuinely hopeful for the first time since the crisis had erupted. The framework they had developed was working not just as a conflict management system, but as a foundation for effective collaboration. As the participants left the meeting room, the atmosphere was notably different from the tension-filled encounters of just a few weeks earlier. While challenges would certainly continue to arise, the royal family had demonstrated that personal conflicts could be resolved through structured dialogue, clear protocols, and a shared commitment to their public mission. The palace corridors that had buzzed with worried conversations and speculation just a month earlier were now filled with the normal sounds of efficient royal operations. Staff members moved through their duties with confidence in the stability of the household. Charitable organizations felt assured of reliable royal support, and the public continued to benefit from effective royal service. The crisis had been painful and disruptive, but it had ultimately led to improvements in how the royal household operated. The new protocols and coordination structures were more sophisticated and effective than the informal arrangements they had replaced. Most importantly, the experience had demonstrated that even serious family conflicts could be resolved constructively when all parties prioritized their public responsibilities over personal grievances. As evening fell over the palace grounds, the lights in various offices and meeting rooms reflected the ongoing work of an institution that had weathered another challenge and emerged stronger. The royal family's mission of public service continued, supported by better structures and relationships that had been forged through conflict and tested through collaboration. The story that had begun with a fiery confrontation over flower arrangements had evolved into a case study in conflict resolution and institutional adaptation. While Lady Beatrice and Princess Isabella might never become best friends, they had proven that effective professional relationships could be built even between people with significant personal differences. The palace, with its centuries of history and tradition, had once again demonstrated its capacity to evolve and adapt while maintaining its core mission of service to the nation and the charitable causes that depended on royal support.